The water had never felt so cold. Baba Kofi, the fisherman, stood knee-deep in the river, gripping his net tighter than usual. It was early morning, but something didn't feel right. For the first time in his life, he was afraid of the river. His father had always told him that the river had its moods. Some days it was generous, giving fish until the net was heavy and full. Other days it was angry, swallowing anything that touched it. Today, it felt angry. Baba Kofi had been fishing all his life, just like his father and grandfather before him. He lived in a small village on the edge of the river, a place where everyone knew everyone's business. His house was made of mud bricks with a small thatched roof, and he shared it with his wife Amma and their 2 children. Life was simple, and the river had always provided for them. But for the last few weeks, the fish had stopped coming. Each day, Baba Kofi would go out with his net and return with nothing. Amma would say, "Maybe tomorrow will be better." But Baba Kofi had begun to doubt that. His neighbors were suffering too, and soon people began to whisper that the river was cursed. The village elder, old Nana Kwame, called for a meeting. The whole village gathered under the big baobab tree, waiting for the old man to speak. His voice was shaky, but it carried authority. "The river is upset," he said. "We have taken too much and given nothing back. It demands a sacrifice." Baba Kofi's heart sank. He had heard stories of the old days when villagers would offer sacrifices to the river. But those were just stories, right? Sacrifices were from a different time. They couldn't be real, could they? "Who will offer themselves?" Nana Kwame asked, his old eyes scanning the crowd. No one moved. The air was thick with tension, and even the birds had stopped singing. Everyone was afraid. Later that night, Baba Kofi couldn't sleep. Amma sat beside him, quiet and worried. She had been growing thinner with each passing day. Their children had less to eat, and the village was on the edge of desperation. "What if the river really is angry?" Amma whispered. Baba Kofi didn't answer, but deep down, he knew she was right. Something had changed. The next morning, Baba Kofi woke before the sun. He kissed Amma softly on the forehead, careful not to wake her. He looked at his children, their small bodies curled up under a thin blanket. Then, without another word, he picked up his fishing nets and headed for the river. The river looked darker than usual, its surface like glass, reflecting the gloomy sky above. Baba Kofi waded into the water, throwing his net wide like he had done 1,000 times before. But this time, the net felt heavier than usual. As he began to pull it in, he noticed something strange. The water around him seemed to pull back, like it was breathing. He yanked the net harder, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the water surged forward, pulling Baba Kofi under. He gasped for air as the river swallowed him, pulling him deeper into its depths. The cold water pressed against his chest, and his lungs screamed for air. In that moment, Baba Kofi realized that the river wasn't just angry, it was alive. He struggled to free himself, but the more he fought, the tighter the river's grip became. His vision began to blur, and his arms grew weak. Just as he thought he might drown, he felt something tug at his arm. With a final burst of energy, he kicked upwards, breaking the surface and gulping in fresh air. Baba Kofi stumbled back to the shore, his body shaking with exhaustion. The river had let him go, but it had taken his net. For the next few days, Baba Kofi didn't go near the water. He stayed at home, too scared to return to the river that had nearly killed him. But the village was growing restless. People were starving, and the whispers grew louder. "The river is angry," they said. "Someone must pay the price." Baba Kofi knew that if no one acted soon, things would only get worse. So, one evening, he gathered the village elders and made a decision. "I will go to the river," he said. "I will offer myself." Amma cried when she heard the news, begging Baba Kofi not to go. But he had already made up his mind. "If the river takes me, maybe it will spare the village," he told her. "Maybe it will bring the fish back." The next morning, just as the sun began to rise, Baba Kofi walked to the river for the last time. The villagers followed behind him, their faces somber. No one spoke. When they reached the water's edge, Baba Kofi stepped forward, feeling the cold water lap at his feet. He closed his eyes, whispered a prayer, and waded in. The river felt different this time, calmer, almost welcoming. He walked deeper until the water reached his waist, then his chest, and finally his head. The villagers watched in silence as Baba Kofi disappeared beneath the surface. For a long time, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the water. Then, just as the sun reached its peak, something incredible happened. The river began to ripple, and small fish broke through the surface, jumping and splashing in the air. The villagers gasped, their hearts pounding with hope. The fish had returned. From that day on, the river flowed peacefully, and the village never went hungry again. But Baba Kofi never returned. Amma would often sit by the river, staring out at the water, waiting for her husband to come back. The children grew up hearing stories of their father, the man who had given his life for the village. And every year, on the day Baba Kofi disappeared, the villagers would gather by the river to remember the fisherman who had made the ultimate sacrifice. The river, it seemed, had finally been satisfied. Amma sat by the river every morning, watching the same spot where Baba Kofi had disappeared. She never stopped hoping. The days turned into weeks, and then into months. The village began to heal. The fish were plentiful again, and the people's bellies were full. Life returned to the way it was before, but Amma's heart remained broken. The children, Kweku and Ajoa, grew up with only faint memories of their father. Kweku, the eldest, remembered how Baba Kofi had taught him to cast a net, showing him how to read the river and predict where the fish would be. But now, Kweku avoided the river. He feared it as if it had stolen his father and might come for him next. Ajoa, still too young when Baba Kofi disappeared, had no memory of her father, but she could see the sadness in her mother's eyes every time the river was mentioned. She often sat with Amma by the river, holding her hand, asking questions about the man she barely knew. What was Baba like? She would ask, and Amma would tell her the same stories, each time with a tear in her eye. He was strong, Amma would say, and kind. He loved this village and his family more than anything. One evening, Kweku, who was now 14, came to his mother with a request. "I want to go fishing, Mama. The village is full of fish again. The men are bringing home big catches every day. I think it's time I go out too. Baba would want that." Amma's heart clenched at the thought. "The river took your father," she whispered. "I can't lose you too." But Kweku was determined. "I will be careful, Mama. I will respect the river, just like Baba taught me. It's time." That night, Amma stayed awake long after the children had gone to bed, thinking about Kweku's words. She knew he was right. He was growing into a man, and the village depended on fishing. But the fear of losing him, just as she had lost Baba Kofi, was too much to bear. She prayed for guidance, but the only answer she received was silence. The next morning, Kweku prepared to go fishing for the first time since his father's disappearance. Amma watched as he gathered his father's old net, the same net Baba Kofi had used every day. It had been mended many times over the years, the knots tightened and the holes patched. Kweku slung it over his shoulder and kissed his mother's cheek. "I will be back before sunset," he promised. Amma nodded, though her heart was heavy with fear. "Be careful," she said softly, watching as her son walked toward the river, his silhouette so much like Baba Kofi's that it made her chest ache. The sun was high in the sky when Kweku reached the riverbank. The water was calm and the fish were visible just beneath the surface, glinting in the sunlight. The other fishermen greeted him warmly, encouraging him as he prepared to cast his net. "Your father would be proud," they said. Kweku waded into the river just as he had seen his father do so many times. The water felt cool against his skin, but he wasn't afraid. He threw the net, watching it spread wide and sink below the surface. For a moment, everything seemed peaceful. But then, just as he began to pull the net in, something strange happened. The water around him rippled, and a cold chill ran down his spine. Kweku's hands trembled as he tugged at the net, but it wouldn't budge. It felt stuck, just like the day Baba Kofi had been taken by the river. Panic surged through Kweku as the water began to swirl around him. He yanked harder on the net, but it was no use. His feet slipped on the riverbed and he felt himself being pulled under. Suddenly, he remembered his father's words. "The river is alive. You must respect it." He stopped struggling and let go of the net. As soon as he did, the water calmed and the strange pulling sensation vanished. Kweku stood there, chest deep in the water, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked down at the river, and for a moment he thought he saw something beneath the surface. A shadow, a figure. His breath caught in his throat as the image became clearer. It was a man, standing in the water, looking up at him. Kweku's heart skipped a beat. "Baba!" he whispered. The figure didn't move, but Kweku knew. It was his father, Baba Kofi, standing beneath the water, his face calm, his eyes filled with something Kweku couldn't quite understand. He felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Fear, sadness, love, all at once. "Baba," Kweku whispered again, his voice trembling. He took a step forward, reaching out, but the figure began to fade. The river rippled once more, and Baba Kofi was gone. Kweku stood there, stunned, his heart racing. Had he really seen his father, or was it just his imagination? He wasn't sure, but something deep inside him told him it was real. Baba Kofi had come to him, even if only for a moment. With shaky hands, Kweku pulled the net from the water. It was empty, but he didn't care. He had come to the river to fish, but he had found something much more important. When Kweku returned to the village, he went straight to Amma. She was waiting by the door, her eyes filled with worry. But when she saw the look on Kweku's face, she knew something had happened. "Mama," Kweku said softly, "I saw him. I saw Baba." Amma's eyes widened, and for a moment, she didn't speak. Then, tears welled up in her eyes, and she pulled Kweku into a tight embrace. "Tell me," she whispered. Kweku described what had happened at the river, how the water had pulled him, how he had let go of the net, and how he had seen his father beneath the surface. Amma listened quietly, her tears falling freely. "I always knew he was still with us," she said, her voice breaking. "The river didn't take him away completely. He's still watching over us." From that day on, Amma's visits to the river became less about mourning and more about remembering. She would sit by the water, telling stories to the children about their father, smiling through her tears. The river, once a source of fear and loss, became a place of connection, a place where Baba Kofi's spirit lingered. Kweku continued to fish, but he always remembered to respect the river, just as his father had taught him. And every so often, when the water was especially still and the light hit it just right, he thought he could see a figure standing beneath the surface, watching over him, guiding him. Life went on as it always does. The village thrived, the fish remained plentiful, and the people never forgot the fisherman who had given his life to save them. Baba Kofi's sacrifice had not only restored the river, but had left a lasting legacy in the hearts of those he loved. And even though Baba Kofi never returned, he was never truly gone. The river kept him close, a part of its flow, forever intertwined with the village he had saved. As the years passed, Kweku grew into a man, respected by the village for his skills as a fisherman and for the quiet strength he had inherited from his father. He often went out on the river, always with a deep reverence for the water that had shaped his family's destiny. The elders spoke of him with pride, saying he had the same heart as Baba Kofi, a heart that understood the delicate balance between man and nature. Ajua, now a young woman, had also grown close to the river in her own way. She didn't fish like her brother, but she spent her days gathering herbs along the river banks, tending to the sick with remedies passed down by the women of the village. The river gave her the plants she needed, and in return, she treated it with the same respect that her father and brother had shown. Though she hadn't seen the vision Kweku spoke of, she often felt her father's presence nearby, as though the gentle breeze or the rustle of the reeds carried his spirit. Amma grew older too, her once dark hair now streaked with grey, but her eyes, though softer with age, still held the same quiet determination they always had. She never remarried, though many in the village urged her to find a new husband. Baba Kofi is all I need, she would say, with a smile, touching her heart. She continued to live in the small mud brick house they had shared, raising her children to honor their father's memory and the lessons he had taught them. One particular year, the rains didn't come as they usually did. The river, which had always been so abundant, began to shrink. The fish became scarce again, and the villagers grew worried. They feared that the river might be angry once more. Whispers spread like wildfire, and people began to speak of sacrifices again, fearing that without one, the village would fall into famine. Kweku heard these whispers and was reminded of the stories of his father. He knew that something had to be done, but he didn't believe that the river required another human life. He had seen Baba Kofi beneath the surface once before and knew deep down that his father wouldn't want someone else to pay the price he had already given. So one night, Kweku made a decision. He would go to the river, not to fish, but to ask for guidance. He prepared for the journey quietly, telling no one, not even Amma or Ajua. Under the cover of darkness, he took his father's old fishing net, now worn with years of use, and walked down to the water's edge. The moon was high, casting a silver glow over the river, which was now much narrower than it had been in years past. The air was thick with the weight of uncertainty. Kweku stood at the riverbank, the memories of his father swirling in his mind. He could almost hear Baba Kofi's voice in the wind, reminding him of the respect the river demanded. Kneeling by the water, Kweku dipped his hands into the cool current and closed his eyes. "River," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the night, "I come to you as my father did. I ask for your guidance. We are grateful for all you have given us, but now we fear your anger once more. If I must give something of myself to bring peace, then so be it." For a long time, there was only silence. The river seemed indifferent, its surface smooth and still. Kweku waited, unsure if his words had been heard. But then, as he was about to give up, the water began to ripple gently. The current grew stronger, swirling around his feet. He stood up, his heart pounding, wondering if he would see his father again. But this time, there was no figure beneath the surface. Instead, the river began to speak in a different way. The net in Kweku's hands tugged lightly, as if something small had caught in it. Surprised, he pulled the net in slowly. When he lifted it out of the water, he found a single, small fish wriggling at the bottom. It was no bigger than his palm, its silver scales glinting in the moonlight. Kweku frowned at first. One small fish wouldn't feed the village. But then he remembered his father's lessons, how the river sometimes gave small signs that carried great meaning. He held the fish carefully, lowering it back into the water. As he released it, the current seemed to grow stronger, and the fish swam away with surprising speed. Kweku watched it disappear into the depths, and suddenly he understood. The river wasn't angry. It wasn't demanding more sacrifices. It was warning them. Kweku returned to the village at dawn, his mind racing with what he had learned. He went straight to old Nana Kwame's house, waking the elder from his sleep. The old man listened carefully as Kweku explained what had happened at the river. "The river is telling us to stop taking so much," Kweku said, his voice urgent. "We've been greedy, taking more fish than we need. It's not angry, it's protecting itself. If we continue this way, the river will dry up and there will be nothing left for anyone." Nana Kwame nodded slowly, his eyes filled with understanding. "Your father was wise, and it seems you have inherited his wisdom. You're right, Kweku. The river has always provided for us, but we must give it time to heal. We must learn to take only what we need, or we will lose everything." The next day, the village gathered once more under the baobab tree. Nana Kwame, supported by Kweku, addressed the crowd. He told them what Kweku had learned, how the river wasn't demanding a human sacrifice, but rather a change in how they lived. They needed to take care of the river, just as it had taken care of them for generations. At first, some of the villagers were skeptical. They had been taught for so long that sacrifices were the only way to appease the river. But as Kweku spoke of his experience of the small fish that had carried a message of balance, they began to understand. Slowly, the whispers of fear faded, replaced by a new determination. From that day forward, the villagers began to practice more sustainable fishing methods. They set limits on how much they would take, allowing the river time to replenish itself. They cleared the banks of debris and built barriers to prevent erosion, treating the river with the respect it deserved. As the seasons changed, the rains finally returned, and the river swelled once more, bringing with it a new abundance of fish. The village thrived, not because they had taken more, but because they had learned to give back. Amma watched her children grow, proud of the way they had honored their father's legacy. She knew that Baba Kofi was still with them, watching over the village and the river that had been his life. And every time the water shimmered under the light of the setting sun, she smiled, knowing that he was at peace. The village too would always remember Baba Kofi, the man who had once offered everything for their survival and whose wisdom continued to guide them long after he was gone. And as long as the river flowed, so too would his memory, carried in its currents, forever a part of the land and the people he had loved. Years passed, and the lessons that Baba Kofi and Kweku had imparted to the village became the foundation of their way of life. The village flourished, not because of any grand wealth or external influence, but because they had learned to live in harmony with the river and the land around them. Kweku, now a respected elder himself, had a family of his own. His children too learned to cast nets and read the river's moods, though they were careful never to take more than the river was willing to give. The older villagers often pointed to Kweku as a reminder of the wisdom that had saved the village all those years ago. One bright morning, when the river was calm and full of life, Kweku's eldest son, Kwasi, came to him with a serious look in his eyes. He had turned 16 that year, tall and strong, with the same quiet determination that had been passed down through the generations. "Father," Kwasi said, his voice steady, "I want to know the full story of Baba Kofi. You've told me many times how he saved the village, but I want to understand more. Why did he go to the river alone? Did he know he wouldn't come back?" Kweku looked at his son, seeing himself at that same age, full of questions, full of a desire to understand the things that shaped their family and their village. He nodded slowly, motioning for Kwasi to sit beside him by the water's edge. "I think you're ready to hear the full story, Kwasi," Kweku began. "What your grandfather did was not just about saving the village from hunger. It was about something much deeper, something that is hard to explain with words alone." Kwasi listened carefully, his eyes never leaving his father's face. "You see," Kweku continued, "your grandfather understood the river in a way that few people do. He knew that it wasn't just a source of fish and water. It was a living thing with its own spirit, its own way of communicating. Our people had forgotten that for a time. They took from the river without thinking, without remembering that we are part of a cycle. The river gives, but it also needs to be respected." Kweku paused, his gaze drifting to the river, its surface shimmering in the sunlight. When the fish stopped coming, the village was desperate. People believed that a sacrifice was the only way to fix things. But your grandfather didn't believe in taking life unless it was truly necessary. He knew there was another way, but he also knew that the village needed to believe in something greater. So, he made a choice to offer himself, knowing that the river would not take him out of anger, but as part of that balance. Kwasi frowned slightly, trying to understand. But how did he know the river would take him? And why didn't the river bring him back, like it did with you when you saw him? Kweku sighed, remembering the moment he had seen his father beneath the water. "That's something I've asked myself many times. I believe the river took him because it needed to remind us all of the cost of greed. But it didn't take him to punish us. It took him because he was willing to become part of the river, part of the life that sustains us all. And when I saw him that day, I believe it was the river's way of telling me that my father was still with us, just in a different form." Kwasi sat quietly for a moment, processing his father's words. "So, grandfather didn't die for nothing. He became part of the river, part of what keeps us alive." Kweku nodded. "Yes, and that's why we must always respect the river, Kwasi. Not because we fear it, but because we are connected to it. It gives us life, and in return, we must take care of it. Your grandfather understood that, and I hope one day you will too." Kwasi stood up, looking out at the river with a newfound sense of reverence. "I think I understand now, Father. I want to honor Baba Kofi's memory, just like you have." Kweku smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "You will, Kwasi? I know you will." As the years continued to pass, Kwasi took his place among the fishermen, learning to read the river as his father and grandfather had before him. He carried with him the stories of Baba Kofi and the wisdom of respecting the delicate balance between man and nature. The village thrived under the watchful care of the river, which flowed as steadily as ever, never once betraying the trust that Baba Kofi had given it. And every now and then, when the light was just right and the river was still, the people would say they could see a shadow beneath the surface, a figure standing tall, watching over them, guiding them. It was said that Baba Kofi's spirit still walked the riverbed, ensuring that the village never forgot the lessons of respect, sacrifice, and gratitude. Amma, now in her old age, had lived a long life filled with both sorrow and joy. She had watched her children grow, had seen the village rebuild itself, and had felt the presence of her beloved husband in every ripple of the water. As she sat one evening by the river, the sun setting in the distance, she felt at peace. She closed her eyes and let the memories wash over her like the gentle current of the river. "I will see you again soon, Kofi," she whispered softly, smiling as the wind carried her words across the water. And in that moment, as the village prepared for another day of fishing, another day of life, the river seemed to shimmer a little brighter, as though it too remembered the fisherman who had given everything for the people he loved. Baba Kofi's story would live on, not just in the memories of the villagers, but in the very heart of the river itself, forever flowing, forever guiding, forever watching over the ones he had left behind. And as long as the river flowed, so too would the legacy of the fisherman's last net, cast not just to catch fish, but to catch the wisdom that would sustain generations to come. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, like the video and comment on what you learned from the video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more enchanting tales just like this one. Thank you.